Hello. I am the Linux Mitch. Today I'm going to talk about the kernel, the Linux kernel, that is. And I'm not going to go into a virtual machine. I'm going to stay in my main production computer. So let's get to it. So, like I said, I'm in my main production computer. It's running Arch Linux with the Spectre window manager. And today is Sunday, November 24th. And on Friday, November 22nd, 2 days ago, Kernel Dot Org released a brand new stable kernel. And that's what I'm going to talk about. So right now I'm on workspace 1, but I already have Firefox opened on workspace 3. I'm going to hit mod key 3, and it's going to take me to workspace 3. So right now I'm on workspace 3, and I already have my web browser open up, and I'm at kernel.org. The latest release is 6.12.1. You can see right here, the stable kernel. It was released on November 22nd, which was 2 days ago on Friday. And that's the latest and greatest stable kernel. Now this kernel, you see there's two stable kernels there. Now this kernel, 6.11.10, rumors are that they're going to make that the next long-term support kernel. But I don't think anything official has come out about that yet. And then, of course, right now, this one here, 6.6.63, right now, that is the official long-term support kernel. And then you have all these older long-term support kernels. So like I said, they never keep, when a brand new stable kernel comes out, for a short while, there's always two stable kernels, and either the older stable kernel gets taken away and is gone, reaches end of life, EOL, end of life, and is gone, or they take the older stable kernel and make it the most current long-term support kernel. But they won't keep two stable kernels up here for very long, maybe a few days, maybe a week or two. I'm not sure exactly how long. And what happens with the stable kernel is every 3 months they come out with a new one. So in 3 months, what's going to happen is this one here. First of all, the kernels are usually updated at least once a week and sometimes 2 times a week. And they're bug fixes. Now, they're not really bug fixes, they're security patches. And what ends up happening is the long-term support kernels get only security patches or bug fixes. And the most current long-term support kernel receives more security patches than the older long-term support kernels. Now, the stable kernel, the next one is going to be 6.12.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. The stable kernel gets security patches or bug fixes, but it also gets improvements to it. And finally, in 3 months, we're going to go to the latest release in 3 months will be 6.13. And 6.13 will have even more new features in it, as well as security patches. So like I said, normally the second stable kernel, after a week or so, it's going to get removed off the list, and it's going to be end of life, EOL, or it's going to become the next newest or latest long-term support kernel. Now, if you want to know what's going on, let's go back up to the top. You could go to releases, and it talks about here, you could read this. I'm not going to read it to you. It talks about the mainline, the stable, and the long-term support, and it gives you a chart. So for instance, 6.6 kernel, let's go back. Where's the 6. Oh, here's the 6.6 kernel. Right now, that is the most current, latest, and greatest long-term support kernel. Now let's go forward to the next page. That is going to be supported until December 26th. Well, projected EOL. So projected EOL means it's not carved in stone, but most likely it's going to be supported with security patches until December 26th. So almost 2 more years. and all these other kernels too. Now, this 4.19 kernel, look at this one. 4.19 kernel, end of life, EOL, end of life is this coming December, and December is next week. So let's look at it. Let's go back. It's a really old kernel. So this long-term support kernel, 4.19, it's on point 324, 324 versions. And it was just updated on November 17th, 2024. And of course, that would just be security patches and bug fixes. There wouldn't be any new features in the kernel, and the kernel wouldn't work with new hardware. So the end of life of this kernel is in a week. I don't know if it's going to be the beginning of December or the middle of December or the end of December, but eventually this kernel is going to come right off the list. Okay, so like I already mentioned, rumors are this stable kernel 6.11.10 is going to become the latest recent long-term support kernel. And another thing I want to show you, let's go back to the next list. Just take note of this name, Greg Cora Hartman. Okay, he's one of the maintainers of the kernels. Now you can go down here and read more information about the kernel. Should I use the stable kernel or the long-term support kernel? And if I'm going to use the long-term support kernel, which one should I use? The most recent one or an older one? This Greg Cora Hartman wrote an article about it, and I'm going to go to it. I'm not going to read it to you, so don't worry about it. I'm going to talk about it, and it's right here. What kernel should I use? And this was written in 2018. And it's kind of dark, eh? Let's make that a bit bigger. And my face is blocking some of the wording, but I don't care because I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to leave the link in the show notes. So if you want to go and read it yourself, you're free to do so. So I've read this article several times over the past few years, and I reread it again today before turning on the camera. And this was written in 2018. So it's kind of old, but I don't think it's outdated. And I'm just going to scan down quickly what kernel to pick. Look at the latest stable kernel was 4.18 when he wrote this. Now we're in the latest stable kernel is 12. So let's scan down. He talks about distribution kernels, the latest stable release, the latest long-term support kernel, the older long-term support kernels. Okay, takes you to that page that I was showing you. He talks more. Let's talk about unmaintained kernel releases. And he gives a summary. And this summary, if you want, you could just read that yourself, and I'm not going to read it to you. So his advice is that you should always use the kernel provided to you from the distribution that you're using, from the Linux distribution that you're using. Just use the kernel that they give to you. And he recommends using the stable kernel. And the reason why is that the stable kernel works with newer hardware. It has new features in it and also bug fixes. So he always recommends for desktop environment using the stable kernel. And if for some reason you can't use the stable kernel, then he recommends using the most current long-term support kernel. And he doesn't recommend using these older long-term support kernels unless you have to, because the older long-term support kernels won't have, well, let's put it this way. The most current long-term support kernel is going to have newer features in it than the older long-term support kernels, and it's going to have more security and bug fixes and patches than the older long-term support kernels. So number one, his advice is always use the kernel provided to you by your distribution. Secondly, his advice is to use the stable kernel. And if for some reason you can't and you have to use a long-term support kernel, then to use the latest, most current long-term support kernel. I want to go to the Arch Linux website because all my computers are on Arch Linux. And I guess I do, I don't know, 75% of my videos are about Arch Linux, even though I do videos on Linux Mint, MX Linux, Artex Linux, Antex Linux, Manjaro, and so forth. And I even did some videos on BSD, FreeBSD and GhostBSD. But most of my experience is with Arch Linux, and most of my videos are about Arch. So what I'm going to do is I'm on Arch Linux website right now. I'm going to go to the wiki, and I'm going to type in kernel, and I'm going to click it on. And you can learn more about the kernel from the Arch Linux wiki. And you can read this, and I'm going to scan down. So in Arch Linux, the officially supported kernels are stable, hardened, long-term, LTS, real-time, and the real-time has a real-time stable kernel and a real-time long-term support kernel. And they also support the Zen kernel. Now, if we go back to Kernel Dot Org, you see those other kernels aren't here. There's no real-time kernel, there's no hardened kernel, and there's no Zen kernel. And also, like in Arch Linux, the real-time kernel, there's two of them. There's a real-time stable kernel and a real-time long-term support kernel. They're not here. So what Arch Linux does is they take the stable kernel and they harden it. They do things in the kernel to change it. Let's just go back here. The real-time kernel, they take the stable kernel and they do things to it to change it. And I really don't know what they do, but they do things to change it, the stable kernel, and they take the most current long-term support kernel and they do things to change it. And in the Zen kernel, I think also they take the stable kernel and they change it as well. And I really don't know what they do. Now, I've done videos where I've installed the hardened kernel, and I did earlier this year, I did quite a few videos where I installed the real-time kernel and I installed the real-time long-term support kernel, and it was very light. I think I was only running on 180 megabytes of RAM. And I ran my main production computer for a month or so, maybe two. I ran the Linux real-time long-term support kernel. So like I said, most of my time in using Arch Linux, I've either used the stable kernel or the long-term support kernel. And probably a good part of my time, I've used a long-term support kernel. I've used a long-term support kernel more than the stable kernel. And for some reason, because I thought it was safer because all my machines are older. I don't have any new computers, right? So I've ran the long-term support kernel a lot. And when I first started using Arch Linux, what's happened over the years is that the kernels have gotten heavier. I'm almost at 5 years of Linux. Actually, at the end of December, it's going to be my 5th anniversary of using Linux. And over the years, the kernels have gotten heavier in the sense where the computer uses a bit more RAM, maybe 50 to 150 more megabytes of RAM when it's running with no other applications open, which is really not a lot in the grand scheme of things when compared to Windows, right? When I first started using Arch Linux, I was using the most current long-term support kernel, and the most current long-term support kernel, well, it wasn't this number here, right? That's for sure. But when I used to run the most current long-term support kernel years ago, like I said, my computer could be running at 170 or 200 megabytes of RAM. And when I ran the stable kernel, it would be running 50 megabytes, maybe 100 megabytes more of RAM. So I stuck with the long-term support kernel most of the time, even though I wasn't really short on RAM. The first year or so of running Linux, I had 4 megabytes of RAM. But then I bought more RAM and I moved up to 8 megabytes. This computer has 16 megabytes of RAM. And I have another computer that has 32 megabytes of RAM. So I've never run out of RAM. I've never been short on RAM. So, 100 megabytes here or there doesn't mean anything, really. But I just like the fact that the long-term support kernel is running maybe 50 to 100 megabytes less of RAM than the stable kernel. But anyways, I've noticed over the years that both kernels, the stable kernel and the long-term support kernel, use more RAM. Like I said, in the grand scheme of things, not a lot of RAM compared to Windows or or Apple or whatever, right? Every once in a while, I would go and install the stable kernel. Last March, I think it was March or April, I was running the long-term support kernel on this computer, and I put the stable kernel in and tried to boot into it, and it wouldn't boot. When I was trying to boot into the kernel, partway through the boot process, it just stopped, and there was an error message. I can't show you the error message because I didn't take a screenshot of it. Well, I couldn't. There's no way I could take a screenshot of it. I guess I could have taken a picture of it with my iPad or my iPhone, but so I can't show you what the error message was. I thought it was because I forgot to make grub, because when you added new kernel, you got to make grub, right? Or when you add a different kernel, not when you update the kernel, but when you add a different kernel, you have to make grub. So I tried it again. Again, during the boot process, the computer would jam up. And when it jammed up, there was nothing I could do. I couldn't drop down to a TTY because I hadn't booted up into the system yet. And I couldn't do a resub, like I said, because I hadn't booted into the system yet. And I even tried a resub, and a resub wouldn't do anything. And pressing the power button wouldn't turn it off. So the only thing I could do was pull out the plug and reboot into the long-term support kernel. And then I tried to do a new install. Arch Linux puts out a brand new ISO once a month, usually on the first of the month. And the brand new ISO is not for updating your system. It's for brand new installs. And I always, once a month, when the new ISO comes out, I put it onto a thumb drive, just in case I need to do a repair on my computer. And I like to have the latest ISO on a thumb drive. So I took the latest back in March, or it was either March or April. I took the latest ISO, I had it on a thumb drive. I tried to do a new install. Now, the ISO that comes out once a month, they put on it the stable kernel. They don't put the long-term support kernel on it. Well, it's on there in the sense where when you're doing your install, you can install the long-term support kernel on your new system that's going to be installed. But when it boots up onto the ISO from the thumb drive, it's booting up onto the most recent stable kernel. Now, this stable kernel just came out. So today is November 24th. So on December 1st, Arch Linux will be releasing a new ISO. I suppose this stable kernel will be on it, meaning it will, when you put the thumb drive in, it will boot onto it. Possibly, it might be this kernel. It might boot onto this kernel. But even if it boots onto this kernel, when you go through your install, if you choose to install the stable kernel, when your install is finished, you're going to have this kernel on. And actually, by that time, this might be a 0.2, might be 6.12.2, because Kernel Dot Org usually releases a new point release twice a week, sometimes once a week, but most of the time it's twice a week. Back in March or April, whenever it was, I had a thumb drive with the latest ISO on it. I thought I'll do a new install, or I'll do a repair. I'll plug it in and do a repair. I plugged it in, it wouldn't boot onto it. And since that time, was it either March or April, I've been unable to run the stable kernel on this computer or boot onto a thumb drive with the stable kernel onto this computer. I've had to run the long-term support kernel. Now, I could boot onto the computer with a thumb drive with the ISO from April. I can't remember if it was the one that came out March 1st or April 1st. But I have a thumb drive with an old ISO on it, and I'm able to boot onto that one, which has, of course, the most stable kernel at that time. But I haven't been able to boot onto an ISO with the stable kernel since then, or run the stable kernel. But interestingly enough, I'm able to run the stable kernel on my other computers. Just this one computer, my main production computer. Now, another thing is that I've been having trouble in this particular computer, my main production computer, with two of my USB ports. Two of my USB 3 ports, when you plug a thumb drive in or an external drive into it, it disconnects. It connects, it disconnects, won't stay connected. And, if you're trying to copy files onto a thumb drive, it disconnects. And I suspected that had something to do with being unable to boot onto the stable kernel, but I'm really not sure. I don't know. So anyways, to make a long story short, sorry if I'm talking too much. Yesterday, I noticed that the latest kernel was released. So like I said, every 3 months, Kernel.org comes out with a new kernel. And then twice a week, they do point releases, right? So in a couple of days, this will turn into a 0.2 and then a 0.3 and a 0.4. So when I saw a brand new kernel came out, I thought, let's see if I can get it installed on my main production computer. And guess what? It installed. So this is the first time I've been able to install the stable kernel on my main production machine since March, or maybe April. But I've had the stable kernel running on my other computers fine. Hold the mod key down, because this is the Spectre window manager. I'm going to hold the mod key down and go to workspace 2. And I'm going to hold the mod key down and hit enter to open up my terminal. And you know what? I'm going to hold the shift button down, the shift control, and hit page up. I'm going to make it a little larger. And this is the ST terminal that I'm running. And I'm just going to do uname -r. You can see I'm running the stable kernel 6.12.1. And that's it. In this video, I talked about the Linux kernel. And I explained some things about it. And I talked about the stable kernel, the long-term support kernel, and other kernels. And I talked about the various kernels that are made by Kernel.org and maintained by them. And I also talked about different kernels that you can get in Arch Linux. I also showed you a page, and I'm going to leave the link in the show notes, where you can read an article by one of the kernel maintainers at Kernel.org that explains which kernel he thinks you should use, and he explains the difference between all the kernels. And I also talked about how since March, I've been unable to run the stable kernel on my main production computer, but I've been able to run it on all my other computers. And how I had to stay with the long-term support kernel for this computer, and how in the brand new kernel that was just released 2 days ago, I'm able to run the stable kernel now. And I have it up and running in this machine, and everything's good. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I am the Linux Mensch.